everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Ajoe21love, here with episode number 51 of Sports Review Topics. Thank you for joining me. Got some pretty interesting topics to go over today on the podcast. Among Julio Jones, finally traded. We got the preview going down of UFC 263, which is happening on Saturday. Go over that as well. Adesanya versus Vittori 2. So, yeah. And also why it's unfair to criticize NBA teams, playoff teams, that have been eliminated early, bubble frauds. But going over all that today on the podcast, thank you for joining me again. Like and subscribe if you like this video or not, and if you want to get any more reviews or access to the channel, anything on as far as pro wrestling reviews or sports review topics, subscribe. It'll help, and click on the bell. So thank you, and let's get into the episode today, shall we? So first I want to talk about probably the biggest news that happened yesterday. Julio Jones. Now, this kind of in the weeds for a while. We were thinking, okay, with his salary and them drafting Kyle Pitts, it probably makes sense for them to trade Julio post June 1. That was when his contract and his money were kind of swifted away, and cap hit wouldn't be as big as it would have been prior to June 1st. But he was traded. The Falcons found a trade partner. They traded him to the Tennessee Titans. Now, the Titans were one of the most expected teams that kind of trade for him. There was obviously talks about the Patriots trading for him. The Rams were a possibility. There were, in theory, a lot of teams in the NFL could use Julio Jones. But with the salary and his age, it was a question. But the Titans overall are a pretty good fit for Julio because, first of all, they had a pretty good offense last year. We know Derrick Henry in the backfield. He had 2,000 yards last year. So, and A.J. Brown on one side, who will be going into his third season, and he's had a stellar start to his career. So, the young guy on one side, Julio Jones on the other, and it will allow, because Derrick Henry is the driving force of that offense. So this will ease things up for him as well. And Ryan Tannehill, it gives him another premier target when healthy. Another premier target to go to in the offense. And Ryan Tannehill is vastly underrated. Vastly. I mean, prior to him taking over the reins in 2019, that offense just felt stale. And now with Tannehill making that offense a more balanced offense, and now adding Julio, because some are quick to forget that they won 11 games last year. Now, some will say some of those games were close. Nonetheless, Swift either way. Arthur Smith gone as the offense coordinator. See how, if there's any change much in the offense. See about that. But primarily the biggest question of the Titans this year will be their defense. I think we can pretty much agree because that offense was very good last year. Now, yes, they lost Jonnu Smith and Adam Humphries and Corey Davis, but Julio Jones, is an upgrade over Corey Davis. I think we can all agree. Although Hubby does his best with the Jets. But yes, Julio is an upgrade over Corey Davis. Now, as I said earlier, if that defense now can just improve a little bit, because that defense was not good last year. And with the acquisitions of Danico Autry, Bud Dupree, and Jackrabbit George Jenkins, they can really help on that team. And now with the addition of Julio, because with Carson Wentz going to the Colts, I picked them as the favorite to win the South. Now with Julio coming to the Titans, I may have to change that, because Julio and A.J. Brown, along with Derrick Henry, with Ryan Tannehill, and throwing it to him, it's very, very intriguing. Now, they're obviously not explosive as Kansas City, or Buffalo, nor do I think they're have as much depth as Cleveland is, but this is another step for Tennessee, because we know they're a premier playoff team, but this can help be that extra juice potentially that pushes them to at least the AFC Championship game again, where they were 2 seasons ago, if not further. So good for Tennessee and good for Julio. I mean, I don't think, because the Falcons are in a weird place. They're kind of rebuilding for the Falcons, but I don't think they'll miss Julio that much, because he's been a little injured the last couple of seasons, and they still have, obviously, Calvin Ridley and Kyle Pitts now they drafted, so I don't think they'll miss him too much in the Falcons offense. And besides, they still have Matt Ryan, so they should be fine as far as that regard. Now, Going from the Julio Jones stuff to now UFC 263. UFC 263 happened on Saturday night. Headlined by Israel Adesanya versus Marvin Vettori 2. Obviously, some are still critical, and I was too, that this fight was made instead of Adesanya versus Whitaker, the rematch. But Marvin Vettori, well, I'll get to that, the main event a little bit, but there are some pretty good fights as far as the rest of the card is concerned. Because we got Damian Maia versus Bilal Muhammad. Damian Maia is still doing it. He can still catch you sleeping and make you sleep. He's still the human backpack, technically. Bilal Muhammad is underrated, and you cannot sleep on him. Otherwise, he'll put your lights out. So that's an intriguing fight. And then a fight that was supposed to happen at UFC 262, but an injury by Diaz in training camp. And so it was pushed to UFC 263, excuse me. And good for UFC 263, Leon Edwards for Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz has been out for a while. Leon Edwards saying there, I mean, his last fight, you can't really call it a fight. Because he landed that eye poke, and that was it. So, if you take that away, he really hasn't fought in a few years either. So, in a way, they're on equal grounds. But as we know, Nate Diaz is not really a welterweight. He has fought his last few fights at welterweight nonetheless. So it's going to be intriguing because Leon Edwards is a top contender in the making. But the problem is inactivity, and sometimes his mouth can be a bit too much, as in he's like James Vick in a way. He'll talk and because James Vick, while top contenders weren't facing him, he was so active, whereas Leon Edwards has not been very active. And he complains how top contenders are ducking him. Well, still, it's going to be a good test for Nate Diaz. Then we get to the co-main event, a rematch of arguably the fight of the year last year. Davison Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno. And what was a great fight. Great fight for the flyweight championship. It's going to be interesting to see how both respond from that war that was that fight. So we'll see. And then the main event, Israel Adesanya versus Marvin Vettori 2. Now, the first fight happened when Adesanya was still very new to the UFC. His first couple fights in, and then he fought Vettori, won a split decision. But it's kind of a clash of styles because Adesanya, we know he's in and out. He's a fast-moving striker, and with precision, he also is okay on the ground, but he will get you sleeping. Yes, he lost against Jan in his last fight, but I don't think that will deter him too much because first time at 205, and we know he's a small, or I want to say small, but he's like skinny for a middleweight. I'll say that, and him moving up against Jan, who is a bigger guy, I don't take that from him, but he's undefeated at 185. Vettori, he's come on in his last few fights, has a very good streak going. You know, he beat Jack Hermanson, and when he was basically the filler, and then he beat Kevin Holland in a solid performance. So, if Vettori can impose his will, because, I mean, he's not as big as Paul Costa, but I would say he's a more renowned MMA fighter than Costa is. If he can impose his will and make this a wrestling style and pressure fight, then he's going to give Adesanya perhaps some trouble. But the way Adesanya moves with his strikes, and it's just going to be hard for me to pick Vettori in his against Adesanya. So with my picks overall, I'm going to go with Damian Maia over Belal Muhammad. I'm going to go with Leon Edwards over Nate Diaz. Going to go with Figueiredo over Moreno. And then Adesanya over Vettori. So, yeah, there's that. Nonetheless, intriguing card, and probably going to be hopefully one of the better cards we've seen in a while. And then lastly, the topic I want to talk about today was why it's silly to call NBA playoff teams that have been eliminated playoff or bubble frauds. So, the Miami Heat and the Los Angeles Lakers, who were in the NBA Finals last year, during the bubble were criticized and laughed at for their early exits and unfortunately called bubble frauds, products of the bubble, basically. Now, look, I get it because the bubble was muchly different than all teams were expecting. As different than what the NBA has encountered pretty much ever. And it was a neutral site mostly. There were neutral sites during the bubble. I mean, it was in Orlando. There was no fans really there, so the only people you could count on for support were your teammates during the bubble for NBA teams. Now, if you look back at both of their roads in the playoffs, in the bubble, I mean, for example, for the Miami Heat, they were the 5th seed last year in the bubble. They swept the Pacers. They beat the Milwaukee Bucks in 5 games. They dueled out versus the Celtics, Eastern Conference Finals in a tough series. And that was how they got their road to the finals. Whereas the Lakers, they were the number 1 seed after the. Now, for the Lakers, you can there's kind of points where you can probably say they were fraudulent or more lucky in the bubble than the Heat were, because LeBron James is obviously on the back burner of his career. And Anthony Davis, we know, is injury prone. And being those were their 2 biggest stars, with the bubble, the reset, it gave them time to replenish, gather themselves, and got themselves healthy again. And they tore apart versus the Trailblazers in the first round. The Eastern Conference Finals, they took care of the Nuggets. And I go. Oh yeah, the Rockets in the second round. They took on James Harden and the Rockets in the second round, but nonetheless, I can see why people would say the Lakers. Yeah. And then we all know the Lakers beat the Heat in the NBA Finals. But overall, when you look at the Lakers, you could tell they were not the same team all year. I mean, they had an overhaul on their team, which really, besides LeBron and Anthony Davis and Kuzma, their team and KCP was vastly different. I mean, last year they had Avery Bradley, who opted out of the bubble, but nonetheless was a big factor in them last year. Okay. they lost Dwight Howard, who was very productive for them off the bench. He was the big man off the bench. He did well for them. And then Rajon Rondo, who played very well for the Lakers in the bubble. I mean, yes, we can criticize about his age and where he is in his career, but he did very well in the bubble, very well, and really contributed to them and their NBA championship. Whereas the Heat, they pretty much have the same team from the bubble. And Jimmy Butler played his ass off in the bubble. Adebayo played well. Tyler Hero played well. I mean, Dragic, Duncan Robinson, and they had to deal with injuries as well this season. You know, Jimmy Butler, there was a stage where he was hurt. Duncan, Dragic, I mean, basically, to criticize and say there were frauds in the bubble is just silly. Because what they did in the bubble cannot be overstated. They pretty much won and did really well, but people want to take it back because it was a very different circumstance and it wasn't the same, but it is what it is. And then lastly, because I know I didn't put MLB in the thumbnail, but Jason DeGrom of the Mets, gotta give a little credit for it because he right now with Mike Trout selling out, he seems like, and with Francisco, he got, or excuse me, was diagnosed with COVID. Jason DeGrom right now seems like the MVP frontrunner. Now, assuming the Mets hold on and win the division, we'll see. But nonetheless, it's going good and good for Jason DeGrom of the Mets. So, with that, that's the episode for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. Help out the video. Thank you all. Also, if you can check, I post another AEW Dynamite review on Saturday, so you can check that out if you didn't. But thank you for joining me today. I'll be back on Saturday because AEW is still exempted due to the NBA playoffs for the rest of the month. So I'll be back Saturday with your AEW Dynamite review. So thank you. See you Saturday. Be safe and peace.